I'm going to do something I don't normally ever do. I hardly ever veer from my notes and my sermon. But I think that you probably need to know me a little bit better and the background, and something we never talk about on Mother's Day. This is the hardest day of the year for me to preach a sermon. Because not everyone has all that. They just don't. My mom was 9 years old when her mom died. Her dad remarried. New kids came into the family. And whenever she would see them smoking and threaten to tell that they were smoking, they would take the cigarettes and burn holes in her back. So she had scars all over her back from the cigarette burns. My dad went over to visit, and as he was walking along, he told the story that somebody threw a bucket of dishwater over the bushes and got all over him. He went around the corner, mad as a wet hen, and it turned out to be this little cute girl. Right then, he would have been about 22. She would have been about 12. Several weeks went by. They got to know one another. The story goes, according to them, I wasn't there yet. The story goes, according to them, that she was really bad sick and they didn't know why. They needed to go to the hospital. Dad said, well, I'll be glad to marry her. Take her to the hospital. We'll get her fixed up. So he was 23 and she was 13. They got married. But the bottom line is his dad was a drunk. Her dad was a drunk. And now he's 23, she's 13, they're married. His dad's out drinking one day and running a buzzsaw. You know what a buzzsaw is? Like a round blade that's flat. You push it along, cuts the... Well, he's out there drunk and he shoves that buzzsaw into Dad's foot and cuts it off halfway across. And they go to the doctor and they sew that foot back on way before they knew they could even sew feet back on, and it stayed. But in order to take care of his new bride, he went out and he dug post holes. This is their story. I'm telling the story that they've told me. Once again, I wasn't there. He dug post holes at 10 cents a post hole to make money to take care of him and Mom. And he went to collect his pay, and it turns out his dad had already collected it, went to town and drank it up. And that was the end of his staying there working for his dad. They ran a sawmill. They owned several hundred acres, ran 2 sawmills, and he was working for his dad. He just left it all behind. And Uncle Red brought him to Indiana, and whenever he got to Indiana, he got a job working for the state highway. Red was a foreman there, hired him on, and got him the job. So here's a 23-year-old and a 13-year-old starting a new life in Indiana. Can't have kids for a while, probably a good thing since she's 13. He is 23. About the time they got ready to adopt a kid, lo and behold, ta-da, here I come. And I'm growing up with a mom. Whenever Dad comes home with work, you know what they fought about? Her watching cartoons all day and nothing getting done around the house. Imagine that. Now, that's the fights that I heard growing up. Lots of things happened as I was growing up that made all this not so much so for me. My mom got married really young, had a really hard life, no one to show her how to do anything. So all along the way, she's trying to figure out growing up. At the same time, she's trying to figure out parenting. And it wasn't always easy. She did some things that whenever I look back on them, made me not feel those warm, fuzzy feelings. Let me give you some examples. Start off with, let me kind of set the stage for you. You didn't want to tick off my mama. Give me an example. One day we had this little mini farm back behind the junkyard. We lived on a junkyard, by the way. She went back there one day because the ewes were throwing their lambs. I don't know where they threw them, but I think they gave birth because she's out there cleaning up these lambs. And She's been over working on this land. We had some little veiny chickens, you know what I mean? Little teeny tiny. They're little, but those little things are wicked. Well, one of those little veiny roosters, while she was bent over, decided it'd be a good idea to take those spurs in his back of his feet and whack her in the bottom. I saw my mama stomping into the house. Didn't say a word. Red, she was mad. I didn't know what was going on, but I knew to get out of the way. And I got out of the way. The next thing I know, she's coming back through the house with a double-barrel shotgun. A few minutes later, I hear boom. She came back in, set the gun in the corner, and said, "Don't have to worry about that one no more." You didn't want to tick off my mama. She had a really short fuse, and whenever it went off, there's a really big boom. You didn't want to tick off my mama. But little things happened as I'm growing up that made me not feel those warm, fuzzy feelings. You know, for example, we would go to the store and we'd buy a bag of candy, you know, and we didn't have a lot of money. There wasn't a lot of that came through the house. And she would set the candy up on the counter, and then she would eat that candy throughout the day. And, no, you can't have any, no, you can't. And then it'd be almost gone, then you can have candy. And then my dad would come home and he would say, "Where's that candy at? I want a piece of candy." The answer was, them dad-blamed kids ate it all up. I can tell you, till the day she died, and for a long time after, I wouldn't eat the last piece of anything. I was scared to eat the last piece of anything. I was going to get blamed for it. I mean, I didn't have those warm, fuzzy feelings. Give me another example. One time my sister said something she didn't like, and she was sitting across the room. You remember back in the days when RC Cola came in bottles? Well, she's sitting over on one side of the room, and my sister's sitting over to the other side of the room, and she said something she didn't like, and she took that bottle and threw it across the room at my sister. And instead of hitting my sister, she hit the fish tank, and the fish went all over the floor, water, fish, and all. And Dad come home, and them dad-blamed kids broke the fish tank. What do you say as a kid? How do you fix that? How do you fix that? I didn't have those warm, fuzzy feelings. Mother's Day is a hard day for me to stand up here and preach a sermon. I'm just telling you the other side of it. It's not all warm and fuzzy whenever it comes to that stuff. Dad would go to work in the morning, and Mom would be home with us kids. And we lived in a house that was just pretty much always messy until Dad growled. Whenever Dad growled, it was time to clean the house. I mean, and we're not talking a little bit of clean. We're talking about there's stuff every place. And it just went on and went on until Dad growled. And whenever Dad growled, it was time to clean the house. Well, the way she cleaned the house is she would wait until about an hour before Dad came home from work. And she would go through and she would take her arm and rake everything off all the coffee tables, off all the counters, off the kitchen table. She would wipe it all into the floor, sweep it. We had a little bitty square hallway that joined the rooms, joined the 4 rooms of our house. A little hallway in the middle with the bathroom off to the side. She would sweep all that stuff into that square. And then she would have a belt and she would whip us till we got it picked up. Picked it up, put it away, threw it away, cleaned it up. And if you didn't go fast enough, you know that you were going to get a whipping. And just to give you an idea, one day we were getting whipped for it. And my sister wasn't working fast enough, and I knew I was going to get whipped again. And I picked up a handful of silverware. And then we had a wood floor. I was mad, and I threw that thing of silverware on the floor. And when I did, one of the knives had a kind of a rubbery handle on it, and it bounced up and stuck in my sister's arm. I didn't know if I was going to live through that one. Because my mom had a really bad temper. And that's the way I grew up. So it's really hard for me to have warm, fuzzy feelings like these. I don't have all those warm, fuzzy feelings. The stuff about Mom taking to church, Mom teaching us. I went to church the first time without any parents. I was riding the school bus home, and Christy Oler, next door neighbor, she lived about a mile up the road. She's coming off the bus, and she handed me a little invitation to something called Vacation Bible School, and said she'd be glad for me to come, so I went to Vacation Bible School. Mom and Dad let me go. They went to Uncle Bill's and stayed there, and I'd walk around the corner to Vacation Bible School. And I went there to Vacation Bible School, and it was fun. I mean, they had cookies, and they had punch, and they had games, and they had crafts, and it was 2 weeks long. I thought, this is wonderful. And they told me at the end of Vacation Bible School that they had something called Sunday School every week that was just like Vacation Bible School. So I went home after Vacation Bible School, and I told my mom and dad, I said, I want to go back to Sunday School. It's just like Vacation Bible School. And I get there to Sunday School, and those people lied to me. They didn't have any punch. They didn't have any cookies. They didn't have any games. They taught lessons there. And you had to sit and you had to be quiet. I wasn't exactly sure about this whole thing. But I stayed for worship service afterwards. And up in the front of the church building, I sat on the front pew. I didn't know you weren't supposed to sit on the front. So if you were sitting up in front of the church building there at the church I went to, it would be right there on the pew. And in the floor right in front of that, there was a square hole. And in the middle of the square hole was a round hole. We call them cold air ducts, I know now, but we didn't know that back then. Well, I sat there, and my mom and dad had given me a quarter to put in the offering. I guess they knew that churches took up offerings. And those dabbling men came up there, and they passed out refreshments, and they didn't give me any. It's the puniest refreshments I ever saw in my life anyway. It is a teeny tiny cracker about this big and a cup of juice about this big. I thought, it's that small and you're that stingy? Pass me right over. And then after they passed me over with refreshments, they brought around the offering plate wanting the offering. And I thought to myself, forget that. If I don't get refreshments, you don't get my offering. So I'm sitting there on the front pew, and I'm looking down at that square hole with the round hole in the middle, and I got a quarter in my pocket, and I'm thinking to myself, wonder what that would do. So I took that quarter and I threw it down that round hole, and it went, wee, 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 wee. I thought that was cool. So I wanted to go back to church the next week, not because of Sunday school, because I wanted to put a quarter in that round hole. I kept coming to church. Nobody came with me. You know how it is when a kid comes to church and there's no adults with them? I was trying to figure out what to do, so I was a kid. I explored. There's all kinds of neat holes in that church. There's doors, there's nooks, there's crannies, and they didn't know what to do with me because I was exploring everything, and I didn't have any adult supervision. And finally, I was down underneath the stairs that went down to the basement, and there's a cubby hole back in there that had boxes and boxes and piles of stuff. And I looked in there and my eyes got this. I'd never seen so much stuff. Crayons and markers and colored paper, and it just had all kinds of stuff. They couldn't figure out what to do with me, so finally they said, well, why don't you organize that room for us? So I'd come early, and for weeks I was in there sorting those things. They had me sort them into piles. This color paper here, this color paper there. They were trying to keep me busy and out of their hair, and I thought I was doing something wonderful organizing this thing. And I worked in there, and I did that for a good while, and I got that all straightened up. And by now the preacher's starting to wonder who in the world this kid belongs to that's in here messing around down here coming early, fiddling around in the closets, and he decides he's going to come to my house to visit. Well, back then, preachers wore suits all the time. Well, that doggone preacher came to my house in a suit, and Dad thought he was a salesman. He went running after him, hollering, "You get off my property! I don't have any room for salesmen! I don't want anything you got to buy!" He chased the preacher right off the property. And I went up to him, I said, "Dad, you just chased off my preacher." "Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't know it was the preacher." Why don't you invite him to come eat with us? Invited the preacher home with me. He came. He came to our house, had lunch, and he was talking to Dad about church, about Jesus. I have to realize I'm just a little kid. Yeah? I'm talking 7, 8, 9 at the most, right in that age group there. And he says to my dad, he says, I've got a film strip series that I can bring for you to watch that tells the story of the Bible if you'd like to see it. It's called Fundamentals of Faith Film Strip Series. I know that one pretty much by heart. I'll tell you why as we go on here. I listened as the preacher told Dad he could bring those things by. What he did is he brought by that Fundamentals of Faith Film Strip Series. Now you remember how it was? The old film strip comes in a long plastic strip, and you've got this projector that you flip every time the thing beeps. There was a 33 record. Remember the big records with the little hole in the middle, the 33s, the 45s with the small one with the big hole? These were the 33s with the record player. Carried that record player, carried that screen, the big old screen, and the film stripper would set that up each week, and we would go through that, and it would be talking on the record, and it would go beep, and he would turn to the next slide, and it would go beep, turn to the next. Well, I'm not sitting still, so finally the preacher lets me turn the slide, beep, and I'm turning the slides, and I'm getting pretty good at this turn and slide things, and we're kind of learning as we go, but what he didn't know is my dad couldn't hear right. So this is the first time my dad got to hear the gospel without being embarrassed about not being able to read or write. Told him the story of the Bible. We get done, and doggone it, my dad and mom didn't decide to become Christians and start going to church. And then my dad went nuts. He had a whole bunch of friends from Kentucky. And he just learned from that film strip series that God existed. That God sent his son to die for us, that God could take away sins, that God could make it possible for you to live forever. And he wanted all of his friends to know what he had found out, and he decided that we were going to take that film strip and that 33 record and that record player and that screen thing, and we were going to travel the world. Because we went Monday night, Tuesday night, Wednesday, every place he could get an opening, we took that doggone film strip and that record player, and we showed everybody he knew that thing. Guess what I did? I flipped the screen. Beep, beep. It got to the point I didn't even have to know the beep. I just knew when to do it because I just watched it over and over and over again. Finally, he ran out of friends. But he was dedicated, and they started coming to church. And I was trying to figure out, now what do I do? They can see what I'm doing at church. And my mom's got a little fuse. So I found out they didn't want to go on Sunday evening. I was safe then. So we'd go to church together on Sunday morning. I go on Sunday evening. And I'm telling you, I did some things that I'm remembered for. Like, did you know that underneath pews there's bubble gum stuck underneath there? I crawled around during the service time. The preacher was boring. I crawled around during the service time, and I'd scrape off that bubble gum, and then I'd see how far I could toss it up without, I'd toss it and I'd duck. And I'd go back some years later, and they said, yeah, I remember you. You're that little boy that peeled off the bubble gum and threw it. Yeah, that's the kind of a kid I was. And at home, you couldn't dare do anything, because I'm telling you, my mom had a short fuse. And that makes Mother's Day hard for me. Give you an example. She used a bell or switches. You know what I mean? Switches. You go, well, it wasn't just switches. She had particular switches she wanted. Mrs. Gore it's a beautiful tree. I love playing on it. But it was draped down, and you know what I'm talking about? A willow tree. She would send you over there, and she didn't want one limb off of that. She wanted a handful of those limbs, and she would hold them together like this, and they would wrap around your legs, and when they pulled back, it took the skin. I mean, I'm not talking about a little bit of spanking. It was not good to get whipped with the willows, and it really wasn't good to get whipped with the belt because it left welts, and around the edges it's either red or bleeding. Whenever you get done. My mom had a temper, and one day I'd done something and that temper went off, and I ran underneath the kitchen table, Remember the tables? They were the red Millimac. Ours was red with silver on the edge corners, and then they had the red plastic chairs with the chrome legs. I went back up underneath that table, and she decided she couldn't reach me with that, so she turned around the belt and used the buckle. Decided not to run from Mama anymore. Not a good idea. Better just take it. So I grew up without those warm, fuzzy feelings. So whenever Mother's Day comes, I don't feel like celebrating all that stuff sometimes. It's harder for me to do that. And usually I just write a sermon. And I've got one written. I'll preach it some other time. I was thinking there as I was sitting there by Kim, I said to her as I got up here, I'm not sure which sermon I'm going to preach because I'm not sure my heart is in the one that I have ready. I think I just want to share with them my story because maybe there's other people out there that don't feel all these warm, fuzzy feelings on Mother's Day. Maybe some of you have been through some of these things that don't make Mother's Day quite as pleasant as all this makes it. It makes it sound like every mama is going to come up and hug you and kiss you and love you. My goal was to stay out of my mama's way. If I was out of her way, I wasn't going to hurt nearly as bad if I was in her way. And as a result of that, those warm, fuzzy feelings are not a part of Mother's Day for me. I still love my mama, okay? She gave me life. She brought me into this world, and she told me many times she could take me out. Tried to always remember that. You live longer that way. I love her because she gave me life, and I have watched others grow up without discipline, and I would have rather by far grown up with discipline and turned out like I turned out than to have grown up with no discipline. So I look back on it. None of them killed me, and I was always told if it doesn't kill you, it makes you stronger. Yeah, you guys have been there too. If it doesn't kill you, it makes you stronger. And I think that it probably did. It made me stronger. It made me a better man as a result. As a result of the way I grew up, I married Kim. We discussed it. And you know what the first thing we did was whenever we found out we were pregnant with our first child? Of course you don't, so I'll tell you. Kim and I went to my mom and dad's house, and we sat down with my mom and dad, both of them there, and we looked at my mom, and I did all the talking. I said, I just want you to know, if you ever spank my child the way you spank me, you will never see that child again. And to my knowledge, and the kids would, I think, verify this, they never did spank my... They could sit him on a chair, but they weren't allowed to spank him simply because I knew she didn't know where the off switch was. When she started spanking, she didn't know where the off switch was. So we wanted to make sure that didn't happen to our children. Whenever we had kids, we discussed discipline, and we decided that we would always use our hand. We did that till the teenage years, and it started hurting us, literally worse than it hurt them. So we went to a yardstick, because we figured it would break before we did any damage. To my knowledge, I don't know of anything else, maybe a spoon every now and then, but for the most that we used our hand or a yardstick, or maybe a wooden spoon occasionally. We just didn't spank them with anything else because we didn't want them to have the experience. Kim didn't have any of this. None of this in her family. But this was my family. And by the grace of God, I sit here today having survived childhood. And having been covered by the grace of God. Because I tell you what, as I wrote the original sermon that I had prepared for this morning, it was stepping all over my toes. Didn't feel much like preaching in any way because I need to work on some of that stuff myself before I share it with y'all. But I thought just maybe if you knew my background a little bit better, you would know why I'm constantly saying Mother's Day is the hardest sermon of the year for me. With that said, there's a passage of Scripture I think we'll tie it all together. It's found in the book of Ephesians, and I laid it out because I couldn't make up my mind which message I was going to share. It says here, "For it is by grace that you have been saved through faith. This is not from yourselves. It's a gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast. For we are God's workmanship, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do." God knew all the way through who my parents were going to be, how I was going to be raised. And God had already laid out grace for me. God already knew what I was going to be doing. He already knew how I was going to raise my children. Whenever I see that passage, what it tells me is, in spite of the fact it wasn't always easy, it was right. In the fact that God wanted me to be where I am. And for me to be where I am today, I had to take the journey that I've taken. So I look back with all that said, Mother's Day is a harder day for me than most to preach a message. But the reality is, by the grace of God, I stand here before you today. Here's the neat thing. Through the ups and through the downs, God loves us. Through the ups and through the downs, God knows us. Through the ups and through the downs, God is with us. When you remember that, if you are a child or a young person that's facing a hard time with mothers or fathers, God's there with you. If you've already been through that and you're trying not to let that happen again with your children, God is there with you. You can do it by the grace of God. You can overcome that. I think any one of our kids would tell you they have not experienced any of those things. And I could tell you more, but I won't. The bottom line is, God's there. In the good times and in the bad times, God has been there for me. And God promises that in the good times and in the bad times, He'll be there for you. But you've got to invite Him in. He wants us to choose to live faithfully for Him, whether it's easy or whether it's hard. But the choice is ours. He says, I want to find you faithful. If you're willing to say, God, I want to be faithful to you. God, through the good times and the bad times, I want to walk with you. Then now's the time to come and make that known. As we stand and sing, find us faithful.